So, Gary, when you walk into a room of football luminaries, do you see yourself as a 5-time flag-winning star, 2 Norm Smith medals, 2-time VFL Coach of the Year, or do you see yourself as a sacked coach?
Probably all of the above. I try not to think of the sacked coach situation, but I probably think back and think about that time of being able to be given an opportunity to coach, and you think you know a little bit, but you really know not too much, to be honest. And I guess when I think about the sacked coach, I probably prefer to say, well, I had 9 games to go. The club didn't want to renew my contract, and they told me that if you want to, you can coach the rest of the season in 2004. And we'll obviously do our due diligence and have a bit of a look around for somebody else. Or I said, well, there's not much sense really me staying on for another 9 games, to be honest. But I also think about, too, the last game I ever coached at AFL level, it was actually a winning game against the Dogs. So how many coaches get the flick but after actually being a winning coach?
As we understand it, you were sacked before that but didn't know it. Is that right, that they'd made a decision a couple of days earlier at a board meeting and didn't tell you? Were you aware of that?
No, I wasn't, actually. That's probably the first that I've heard about that. There was dialogue that was going on throughout the course of that early part of the season, because I said to him, look, let's be honest, we want to be men about it. If you don't think that I'm going to be the man for the job anymore, I've got a family that was sort of half living in Melbourne and half coming over to, obviously, South Australia. So for me, it was a case of then trying to think, well, what do I need to do for my family? And obviously, if it was that we're going to come back to Melbourne, it's just not something you can orchestrate in 5 minutes. And I then really felt strongly about the fact that I still wanted to stay coaching. So it was a case of trying to get in if you were not going to be there, and then potentially see if any other jobs were available, because as we know, it's a pretty transient industry, the old coaching. And I remember reading an article once about the great Louis Richards said about coaches, there's only 2 groups of coaches, those that have been sacked and those about to be sacked, and I reckon that's about right.
Well, you did also say that coaches are like ducks in a shooting gallery. Did you feel like that for a period?
Yeah, you do, because as we all know, and you guys are on the other side of the fence, but I probably did get a greater appreciation as I sort of stepped away from AFL footy, that it is very much about what you guys see being journos and what you have to do as a job, whereas I felt at the time coaching, I was just basically having pot shots taken every 5 minutes. And of course, there's that constant innuendo that it's going to happen. You feel like, I guess you're a bit of, as they say, a dead man walking. And it used to be funny, of course, my mum lives in Latrobe Valley, and of course, obviously, I just got to a point where I just wasn't in any way, shape or form entertaining any information that was coming out of the out of the papers or the radio or TV or anything like that. And of course, anyway, as mums do, they love their children. And of course, she'd ring up every second day and she'd say, "Oh, Gary, I just read this about you, or I just heard that about you." I'm going, "Mum, I'm trying not to read it." And here you are reminding me about it every couple of days. But she's a lovely lady.
Give us the 5-year or 4.5-year Adelaide story there. So you took over a club that had won 2 premierships in 3 years.
Yes.
And you had, the first year 9-13, 12-11 an elimination final loss, a prelim loss, a semi loss, and then 8-14 for that team in its entirety that season. It's still a pretty amazing journey.
Well, it's a funny one, really, and I guess, too, don't forget the ill-fated Wizard Cup pre-season competition, I guess, too. We're able to get one of those dirty, great big shields there as well. What did I think about it? It came about quite quickly, too, towards the end of 1999. Geelong was struggling financially, and, of course, quick story, I'd actually approached Brian Cook to extend my contract, and Brian said, "Look, we're in a world of pain financially, things aren't travelling all that well," and I guess I'm summarising here anyway, and he said that we're not really in a position to extend anyone's contract because we really want to, I guess, see the enormity of what the problem is financially.
How long had he been the CEO at that stage?
That would have been probably his first 12 months, I think, from memory. And I'd already had another year, which would have been 2000. So, and then just out of the blue, Adelaide Crows rang, and of course, love talking about footy, and I'll talk to anyone about footy at any time. So, of course, it went from having an initial cup of coffee and then all of a sudden that was really it from my point of view. And 6 weeks later, then it sort of gained a little bit more momentum. And of course, then in the end, it was basically, well, if you're keen, we've got a 3-year deal on the table, and Geelong had one. I guess it becomes a bit of a business decision in the end. You've got a family, young family, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I took the offer. And from a coaching point of view, it probably allowed me to actually sit back and have a look at the facilities of a club that hadn't been all that long in the competition, because obviously their arrival was in 1991, and of course I did happen to play in that first game.
You did too.
At
Famous
Footy Park.
game.
Yeah, that
Ill-fated,
was
yeah.
we'd come off winning the night flag, and of course then we actually went out and got absolutely thumped by the Adelaide Crows. But I don't think any side would have probably beaten Adelaide that night. So yeah, it's amazing. Then some 9 years later, you're actually there at the helm coaching the Adelaide Crows. So it was about having a greater network of coaches around you. Financially, there didn't seem to be too many issues, and it was really probably just being able to coach rather than having potential distractions. So the first year was coming off an early start too, because that was the 2000 Olympics that year, and we had a lot of guys that had been either one left the club because of the two flags, and then 1999 wasn't an overly good season, of course, for the club. And then a lot of guys were having post-season surgery, so that was always going to delay where they were actually going to be able to play and start their season. So going over there, it's like any new job, you go in there and you've assessed your list, and there was a few holes, and of course it was about trying to just keep that group together, knowing that there was a fairly big challenge because, of course, they'd won back-to-back flags in 97, 98, and, of course, coming in after Malcolm, who was a South Australian legend, a football legend, and just an amazing coach.
And he'd pushed them hard as well, so he got maximum improvement out of them.
Absolutely. Yeah. And as any coach would do, that's what you try and do, because you've got a list that really we all know is where it is. You've done your due diligence. You're having a look at, well, geez, I think Mark Stevens had an injury. I think Nathan Bassett might have had an injury. Andrew McLeod might have had an injury, so on and so forth. And then all of a sudden, your first year out, it's not going the way you'd like it. There's obviously that teething period, and but knowing that you still had some pretty good young guys, and the recruiting that we probably did over that 4 years or 5 years by the time I left was almost a relatively new list. We're talking about Biglands, we're talking about Graham Johncock, we're talking about Ben Rutten, we're talking about Nathan Bock, we're talking about Marty Matner, guys that went on and played a lot of really serious footy, and Marty Matner, a premiership player, and of course Graham Johncock over 200 games, Nathan Bock, Ben Rutten obviously, and now he looks like he's going to get the gig at Essendon Footy Club. So, and those guys came off the rookie list back in those days. So you sort of feel that you're building that first year, and then it was about trying to just hold while that group sort of came through, still having guys like Mark Bickley and Nigel Smart and Ben Hart, and there was always going to be that transition period, and I felt we were really starting to build at the end of 2001, 2002. We had a really, really solid, consistent year. Probably the one thing we didn't have was a really one or two really good key forwards. I think everything else was pretty good, and obviously then we ran into Collingwood at the MCG in the prelim, and again it sort of just hit home to me. You can structure up and you can do certain things during a home and away season and probably early finals, but then when you get into a prelim and a grand final, I think we know the big boys and the big power forwards.
Rocker had a day out.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
The crowd was enormous that day.
It was.
Yeah.
It really
the
really
best
was.
day at the footy I've had.
Incredible.
Just going there, beautiful sunshine, prelim final.
It wasn't
mad
Gary's
crowd.
best day.
No, it wasn't, but I just remember that as being a majestic day, even though for you it was torturous.
And as loud as it was, that crowd that day was off the charts in a sense, wasn't it?
It was, because you don't normally hear too much when you're actually coaching, because you get in your cocoon and you're sort of so tunnel vision about what's going to happen, and sometimes you think, where did that 2 hours go of a day in the coaching box? But we could hear that when Collingwood were coming, I think if I remember about maybe halfway through the third quarter, and I just sort of felt this was going to be a fairly big job. And I remember just seeing it later on, the times we got the ball inside our 50, and I think there was Scotty Welsh and a couple of other boys, and we just were, Cloak was a powerhouse, and we just couldn't contain him. And then 03, I thought again we'd sort of just been able to keep a really good nucleus of a side together. And we did come up against the Brisbane Lions, who were absolutely, as we
Marauding.
know, absolutely. Port Power were very, very good. Essendon was certainly, really good in those early 2000s as well. So you need a lot of things going right for you, as we know, with everything. And, made the finals again, and that was 3 consecutive years where the club had never, ever done that before. And, of course, then going into 2004, it was just starting to, for me anyway, a few of the older players were starting to fray around the edges a little bit, and they were not going to get it any better. They were probably closer to their careers finishing than starting. And I remember going into round 1 that year, and I think we had 7 of our best 22 unavailable early rounds. Came up against a rampaging North Melbourne at the MCG, and I thought that day, it's going to be interesting how this all plays out. So, there was constant dialogue with the board, and they would just keep me informed. And, of course, I got the phone call after we'd beaten the Dogs that weekend of the mid-season bye. And I'd already had planned to come in and catch up with the boys as far as their mid-season reviews. Got the phone call. Said, you're on your way in. I said, I am. And it was all over in about 10 or 15 minutes.
And was that Stephen Trigg who delivered the news?
It was.
Tell us what he said to you.
Pretty much he said, we have been, I guess, canvassing some players, which when they're obviously doing that probably just puts up a red flag to me. But you've got your players and your playing group. And, of course, there's probably half a dozen blokes that think you're the best coach that's ever been. You then got another half a dozen that probably feel, he's pretty good. And then you got another half a dozen that, things are going okay, the relationship between the coach and the players. And then you got another half a dozen that are probably on the fringe who are saying, maybe a change is a good thing. So they said that we feel, after talking to the players, that you can't take this list any further. There's obviously development that needs to be because, as I said before, those guys that I mentioned, like Matner and Bock and Rutten and John Cock, etc., and we feel it's time for a change. So my response was, okay. It certainly wasn't a shock because I think probably one of the things that I've been able to do over a long period of time is read the play okay. And I said, okay, if that's how you feel. And basically then they've got a press release, and I thought, well, it's all been obviously,
it's all there,
well organised, and it was pretty early. It was maybe about 9:30 in the morning.
What day of the week is this after the game?
This was on the Monday,
because apparently there was a board meeting on the Thursday night.
Yep,
and that's where the decision was made. So as we were
before
saying
we'd
earlier,
even played,
before we'd even played, your death warrant as a coach was gone.
Yeah, and. I can't remember if they told me about that or not, because I guess what you've been able to think about is that, one is you've just been told that you're finished. And the conversation then went along the sort of lines of, well, we've got this press release and can we have you back at the club at 11 o'clock or 11:30 or something like that. And I said, I'm going home to have a coffee with my, them wife. And I said, send the press release through and I'll have a look at it. And they said, okay. So I think the other thing they might have said was, who do you think should be in the role if you're not? I think that did come out in the course of the conversation.
Even though they already knew who was going to be in the role?
More than likely. Well, of course, it was pretty easy probably to say because Neil Craig had a fairly lofty reputation as far as a strength and conditioning coach and fitness, and of course his background in sport and where he sat. So, and at the time, it made a lot of sense if Neil was going to be the so-called caretaker coach. Well, you may as well get in and sit in the hot seat and see how you perform. And, of course, in Neil's case, the rest is history. Mine was I went home and I had a coffee with my then wife, and of course, we had a bit of a think about it, and I said, I'm not going to go back for an 11 o'clock or 11:30 press release. So I rang the club and said, that all sounds fine. I said, look, really, because knowing what had sort of been the build-up to from a press point of view, I said, look, can we just sort of whack in there about, can you please appreciate, Gary's, I guess, privacy?
Yeah.
And
we ignore that.
Yeah, exactly.
That's
right.
an interesting line. Then we just go and try and call you directly.
Yeah. So, of course, and then obviously they did ignore it because for the next 2 days they were camped out the front of my house.
Is that right?
And
You couldn't leave?
Well, I could because they didn't know that my house backed onto the park. So I'd actually go out through the back door and have a bit of a walk and walk up and down the Torrens and that sort of thing. And anyway, they'd even ring the doorbell and, of course, intercom, and you could see who was there and hiding in the trees out the front and doing all that sort of stuff. I think there might have even been a couple of wooden pallets across the road, and I think they might have been hiding behind those as well. So I thought, well, look, my point of view is, and I think there's probably maybe a bit of an Achilles heel too, is I just call it as I see it, and I guess, from a weakness/strength, I think being my own man has caused me a few problems at different times over the journey. But I thought, well, why do we then go and sit at a table? We've got people there who are going to ask questions, which is fine. But, of course, then it's going to be made out, oh, yeah, we think you're a good fella. And maybe they think you're a good fella, but you can't coach.
Yeah.
So,
Piss
of
in
course,
your pocket when they just
that's
stab
right.
you in the back.
Yeah, and, make it all look like it's all sort of quite amicable, where you've made a decision, which I accept, and you always have to accept the umpire's decision, as we know, or the board's decision. And then, of course, I'm sitting there thinking, no, all I'd want to do is just get out of there because really it's a waste of time. Yeah. For me, anyway. But
what's it like when people are camped outside your house, even though you've got respite out the back, but bit of a bizarre old feeling?
Yeah, it certainly is. And again, you get what they want because they just want to grab and actually, funnily enough, I think my 2 children at the time were walking up the street there a bit later in the day, and they said, oh, where does Gary Ayres live? And, of course, they said, oh, we don't really know. And, of course, they just end up coming in the front door and because they were living in Adelaide at the time. Yeah. So, look, it is. But, again, it's news. It's a big thing. Over there, as we know, it's Adelaide on the front page one day, Port on the back, and then, of course, that just seems to flick and flop, over. But, again, coming across from Victoria, I did feel that there was, genuine support for me as a coach and potentially, I guess, as a person. Okay, you didn't get the Holy Grail, but, again, there's expectations that we always have, and I think what we did, considering everything, was not a bad result. We obviously want the premiership because that's what everyone plays for, but let's be honest, it only happens to be 2 teams will fight for it on any given grand final day, and only one can win.
Pretty bloody hard to win, aren't they? So,
well, law of averages would say if there's 18 sides, you might win one every 18 years, but you're not going to do that.
Adelaide hasn't had too many coaches in their journey. They've had a few, obviously. Quite a number of them have been removed because of player power. Is that a thing that says something about a footy club? We've seen it with Don Pike. We've seen it with Brenton Sanderson. We saw it to a degree with you there as well. Robert Shaw.
Yeah, look, obviously I'm not there for, those other guys that you mentioned. I can only say potentially what was mentioned to me, and you probably want to ask Stephen Trigg and the rest of the board, I guess, from their point of view. But again, when you're within a footy club, it is all encompassing. It is, the playing group are so important. There's no doubt about that. They are probably your most valuable asset that you've got. Now, again, people have feelings, people have egos, and of course you've got to be able to, I guess, delve into what you really, really feel, and then it becomes a decision that's made through all the different groups within a footy club, and obviously the players will say what they say, which is fine. I canvass the players at Port Melbourne all the time, whether it's team selection or, whether it's training, tactics, whatever. It's pretty important, I guess, that they do canvass the playing group, but then hopefully they make the decision that is the right thing.
You said your strength is your weakness. So that's in terms of you being, crash or crash through. I mean, you're a pretty strong character.
Yeah, I'd say in that regard.
Just got you where you are as well.
Well, yeah, that's why I said it's probably a strength and a weakness, I guess, from that point of view. So, yeah, you do learn, and as I said before, thinking about coaching, you think you know a lot, but you know bugger all when you first go in. And I was 34, and coaching guys that were a year or two younger than me, to be honest. And then you get an opportunity, and I used to ring Alan Jeans and what do you think about this? And he'd give you that.
Well, laddie.
Yeah, that's right. I think you should do this, laddie, and do this and do that. So you'd always want to have someone giving you some sort of advice, but ultimately then it's up to you, because you live or die by the sword.
Nigel Smart said at a Sportsman's Night a couple of years ago, he threatened to knock me out. Is that true, and what happened?
Yeah, well, that was interesting, because we'd been in a meeting, and of course, as you try and do, you're chairing the meeting, and of course, I guess the meeting was going down a fairly negative line, and of course, Nigel was saying things that were, I guess, probably in essence, I didn't agree with, and I guess that was a time that you used the coach thing, and it was said, and it would have been said with a fair degree of firmness too. Obviously, it never would have happened, of course,
yep.
But we all say things that, in hindsight, it didn't need to be said, certainly. And I did think about that later on, and it wasn't the appropriate thing to say.
And do you have a reproachment there? And by the same token, he said, "Look, I didn't like the player I was." So he was going through his issues as well. But
he had a couple of weeks to go in his career, didn't he? That was about it.
So how do you? And I think it was his farewell game, wasn't it, that you won in your last?
Yeah, it was.
game?
Yeah, it was.
So how do you work through that stuff with him afterwards, or is that just what goes on in football clubs?
It shouldn't go on in football clubs, obviously, if you really sit here and dumb it down. So, no, we've seen each other at a few functions and just acknowledge one another. There's no, what would I say? It's a long time ago. Just, g'day, Nigel, how you going? Yeah. And that's about the extent of it. So, shouldn't have said it. Move on. There's things that we do in life, obviously, that we turn around and say, hey, that's right. Did I learn about it? Was I, And again, that's one part of the coaching that shouldn't be done, because obviously what you end up doing is you burn a lot of bridges there and then by being emotional. And then, of course, you then spend a lot of time trying to repair that bridge later on. And again, I certainly shouldn't have said it, as I said. But I dare say I wouldn't have been the only coach to say something that he hasn't wanted to take back over a period of time.
How scary were you in your prime? Andrew McLeod said in his book that some conversations with you at the time would send a chill down his spine.
Well, that was probably because I'm just trying to be honest. And again, there are certain ways, as we know, how things should be said and to get that point across. So, scary, someone's interpretation of it, I guess. I certainly wouldn't think that, what we do on a footy field would certainly be a lot more scarier than what I would potentially be. I would have thought, but if, again, that's what Andrew said. Andrew said it.
The McLeod-Edwards stuff, I think their issues really exploded after you'd gone. But, was there some simmering discontent then? And I'm still amazed by the fact they never let any of that stuff off-field impinge on their on-field relationship.
Yeah, well, I never saw any of that, John, to be honest. Like, again, you're in a pretty tight situation, no doubt, as you know, because it is full-time and you're being involved with guys quite a fair bit. There's not really socially wise, there'd be club functions and things like that. But I certainly never saw that in my sort of time down there at the Crows. But again, there are, as we all know, things that can be, I guess, and it's probably testament to the two of them if it was going on, of how professional they both were, because, it just didn't seem to affect when I was there. And again, when it came out later on, I was very, very surprised.
What's it like with a wife and kids, as you say, then wife and two young kids, and your wife was having health issues at the time?
Yeah.
What's that like in a strange old town when, even as Graham Corn says, South Australian fans are more careful around people from other states? The downside of that, the kids at school, your wife in the shops, when you've had a few bad losses.
Yeah. Oh, look, they feel it more so than probably most people, as I said before, about my mum ringing and saying, hey, did you read this or see that? And of course, you're trying to distance yourself from her because you want to try and keep your sanity, I guess. But they obviously love and support you. And that was difficult for all our family at the time because they were spending a lot of time in Melbourne because that's your family network and your support network. And it's a bit, that's the real business side of it. But you come home and you try and be yourself, and you try and be a father, you try and be a husband. And again, that's unfortunately probably a bit of collateral damage, I guess, as to what happens. But people like Graham Corns, I always felt Graham was very supportive, and the times that we'd do our radio interviews and catch up at games and all that sort of thing, I felt, he was understanding of all the pressures, obviously, that you do when you're in a two-horse town. And his support for the Crows, being an ex-coach and all that sort of thing, I always felt was fairly positive and, as I said, understanding, to be honest.
Everyone's always dreamed of being able to recruit Wayne Carey. You were able to do it, all the Wayne Carey Mark II. Tell us about the rationale behind that and how it all took place.
Yeah, well, obviously, as I mentioned before, 2002, at the end of every year you sit down, and it's probably even starts before that, really, to be honest. You're always assessing where your list's at. You're trying to get ahead of the curve. You're trying to obviously have a little bit of a picture about what your group's going to be like, who's going to stay, who's going to go, where should you get your most improvement from. And, of course, then after we sort of sat down, we said, well, you don't have to be Einstein to work out. We need a couple of key forwards if we can get them. And, of course, they're just so hard to try and get. We had guys like Kenny McGregor that were doing an enormous job for us. He was probably a bit of a swingman, from back, forward. And we'd sort of do a little bit of Biglands down there and Matty Clark occasionally just for a bit of a rest. And Scotty Welsh was an undersized forward, obviously doing a pretty good job. So then you think, well, is Wayne Carey, you sort of pinch yourself initially, but then when it became clear that he was thinking about wanting to play again, and obviously there was that South Australian connection, we sort of went along and met him, and the leadership group met him, and obviously met his family. And so it all sort of seemed to be, from what I could see, a reasonably good fit, even though there was obviously those risks associated with the fact that Wayne had been out for a year and there were a few little physical issues. I think at the time he might have had a bit of a knee and there were things that he couldn't do that he once was able to do. But when he got to the club, I used to say to myself, geez, I wish I had had him a lot earlier than what we actually did. And the way he trained, he had to cross-train, swimming. And
he slid into a goalpost at one stage, cut his knee open.
Yeah, he did. And then he got a bit of a neck problem there at one stage. And, of course, but just his footballing IQ was just of such a high calibre. The young guys, Ian Perry was another young forward that was there at the time, and he was working quite closely with Wayne. But the things that Wayne could see was above average, as we know, and he's just an absolute legend of the game. And, some of the games he influenced, and he was important for us, and he probably would say he never really got going because there were just always little things that unfortunately just got him when he was looking like he could possibly put some really good form together. You saw glimpses of it because obviously guys of that nature, they don't lose that talent very, very quickly. And for me personally, I think I had a good relationship with Wayne. We obviously talked a lot about what we would do in relation to his program. And again, they were terrific chats, and you could clearly see why he was an absolute champion of the game. And we obviously had that big build-up to the game.
Did you have to counsel him a little before the grudge match? Did you talk to him?
Yeah, we obviously spoke because, as you try and do, hopefully one of the things I've always been able to do is have a communication/relationship with the players about my expectations and then what their expectations are. And obviously players will just, I'll do whatever you want, coach, I'll play wherever you want, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we'd sort of set it up that obviously this was going to be something that Wayne would have to deal with. But of course we had great leaders like Mark Rasciuto and Tyson Edwards and all these guys that were, as we saw it, Wayne was an Adelaide Crows player. So, of course, when he runs out on the ground, I think about the only thing I said to the group was that if there was going to be any trouble, well, obviously we're going to be flying the flag for Wayne because Wayne's an Adelaide Crows player and he's no longer a North Melbourne player, even though he would go to their reunions and premiership captain and all that sort of stuff. But he's made a decision. We've made a decision. We want to make it work. And we want to be as successful as we possibly can. But
it nearly got physical. That pull punch. I mean, that you talk about cutting the tension with a knife. I mean, that ground just crackled with electricity.
Yep. Yeah, it did. It was, and again, when you're in the coach's box, you probably don't really get a lot of that anyway, as we said before about the Collingwood prelim. But certainly, you could clearly tell there was build-up. There was obviously the rivalry. There was all the other things that we know. But again, Wayne played his role. And he was terrific on the night, and we'd worked out tactically a couple of things, and Wayne just did it beautifully, and yeah, we ended up winning the game.
You succeeded Malcolm Blight a couple of times, but you also coached with him in the year before you took over.
Yep.
You got your best Malcolm Blight coaching story for us?
Well, probably the one that sticks in my mind was the day we were playing down at Cardinia Park, and I'm pretty sure it was Melbourne. And the crowd was getting a little bit hostile about where and how we were probably coaching. And when you're an assistant coach, you just sort of sit in the background and you're in the shadows. That's right. And as we know, he's an amazing man, amazing coach. And I'd like to think that I learned a lot from Malcolm, and he was great for a chat over a glass of red. And I just felt his football knowledge was amazing. And, of course, when you think about during my time at Hawthorn, it was David Park, and then, of course, it was Alan Joyce for a year in 1988. And then, of course, we then were quite successful. And then when Alan Jeans left, well, then it was Alan Joyce. So really, when you think about it, it was fairly stable at Hawthorn as far as the coaches. And then, of course, to be able to have my first coaching year with Malcolm. But I remember walking down with him at three-quarter time, and, of course, he sort of thought that might be, if we don't win this game today, he said it might be you in the seat and not me, basically. But, of course, as great coaches do, they can find a way to inspire, motivate, and just ride through the bumps that obviously were happening at that time. And probably when I think back, it was a catalyst for then the club went on and obviously made another grand final. But there was another time where we're actually out in Waverley, and of course, remember the old coach's box that was sitting there out sort of amongst the bleachers and amongst the supporters. And anyway, the siren went, and it was at quarter time, and we just walked past this chap, and he happened to be just on the edge of the aisle seat. And, of course, he's given Malcolm an absolute spray as Malcolm was walking down to the huddle, and onto the ground. It was quite a fair walk, as we know, at Waverley.
Went forever.
It did. So anyway, of course, half-time's come and gone, and then he said to me when the siren blew for three-quarter time, he said, "Watch this." So he'd remembered where the guy was sitting, and he's walked down, and the guy must have been just thinking about something else, and Malcolm's gone up to him from behind and leant over and went, "Boo!" Well, the guy jumped about 10 feet in the air, and of course then Malcolm just proceeded to go down to the ground at three-quarter time, gave his address, and of course then came back, and the guy put his hand out and shook Malcolm's hand and had a dirty, great big grin on his face, and Malcolm and I were just laughing. So that
You've
was
been thinking about that all quarter. How do you take his mind off
that's
the game?
right,
He's a freak,
exactly.
isn't he?
But that's what he was able to do. He could certainly think about footy, but then also too. But it was just, it was a nice little, I guess, gesture from Malcolm's point of view, but the guy just didn't know what to do.
And that interaction with fans, you actually had a different sort of instance at Geelong when you went back as an Adelaide coach, the famous two-fingered salute to the fan in the coach's box, and I think you may have even raised a bird at one stage and then pointed to the scoreboard as you left.
Yeah, well, that was probably one of those times that John spoke about before, just getting a little bit excited. But, yeah, it's amazing. Look, I guess you get blamed for everything that went on at Geelong, and of course you retired this guy and you retired that guy and all sorts of things. Anyway, you cop it. But I remember we got off the bus before the game, and they were, of course, just given a gobful. Anyway, it was quite an emotional game. There was really not much in the scores all day. And I think Mark Rashudo might have ended up kicking 5 goals. And every time an umpire made a decision, whether it was for Geelong, well, as in Geelong didn't get the decision, of course, it was my fault. And then, of course, when Adelaide got a decision that went their way, that was my fault too. And there was just the constant banging on the coach's box. So it had almost started from like 11:30 in the morning to when we won the game at whatever time, up past 4, 4:45. And I think it got to the point purely where I'd had enough. And, of course, there was an elderly gentleman sitting in the front, and, of course, he just sort of gave me the thumbs up, which was fine. And then, of course, I've just then done the old stick the 2 fingers up. And I think Johnny Reid might have got a little bit excited. I think Darren Jarman might have even got a little bit excited about that then. And anyway, of course, as you do, you go down to the ground, and there was obviously some more, I guess, questioning of my parentage and heritage and my sexual preferences and everything like that. Just sort of went on and on and on. Of course, anyway, as you do sometimes, you just point to the scoreboard, and of course that's not going to change the result. But there was a couple of things afterwards, which were, when we got into the change rooms, the door out into the concourse was actually ajar, and someone, we couldn't see who it was, there was someone trying to close the door, and next thing, this fist just actually came through between the gap in the door and the door frame. And anyway, of course, we shut the door and just sort of move on, and then obviously we have the presser and do all that sort of stuff. Anyway, then when it was time to leave, there was my strength and conditioning coach at the time. We were just sort of walking out there. Anyway, at Cardinia Park, you've got the social club and the cyclone fence, and then of course on the other side is like a walkway. Anyway, there was this guy and his mate on the other side of the cyclone fence, and then there's myself and my strength and conditioning coach just walking along. Well, he's just given it to me, he's just given it to me, he's just given it to me. And anyway, I said to Robbie, my strength and conditioning coach, see up there, that's where the bus is obviously, but the actual cyclone fence gate is open. Now, this guy's either going to shut up before before we get there, or I'm just saying, mate, just
be ready.
Yeah.
Look out.
Exactly. So anyway, we got to the gate, and of course, it was a little bit feisty, I guess, because I just had a gutful of it. And again, it's not a good look, obviously, and I certainly don't condone it. But I said, all right. And then, of course, anyway, I just looked at the guy. And anyway, his mate then grabbed him, and of course his arms are wailing and, doing all this sort of stuff. And I said, oh my God, it's one of those, where, yeah, I shouldn't say it, but give me 5 minutes and I'll be ready to go sort of thing. But anyway, we jumped on the bus and nothing sort of happened. But yeah, you've just got to keep your cool. But as I said before, a bit of a weakness of mine, unfortunately.
Yeah, you you coached the great Gary Ablett Senior,
yep,
which is a privilege and also, a challenge in a number of ways. He wasn't quite at his best, but he was still a mighty player under your tenure.
Yeah, he was. And long story short, we played junior footy together back in Druin in the day. We had my father at the time, and also he was one of the local coppers, and there was another local copper, and one used to coach the under-12s and one used to coach the under-14s, and there's only a year difference between Gary and myself. So, and obviously we'd had a few games together at Hawthorn as well. So
imagine Gary Senior at full forward, and this bloke at centre.
Oh no!
Did you play the same team, or you?
Good luck
yeah,
to the other teams.
We did. Yeah, we did. And one of the other guys.
Too?
Yeah, of course he was. And one of the other guys that played was a guy by the name of Mark Ridgway. Because, of course, Mark went on and had a pretty successful cricket career. And
sure did.
Yeah, and we were, Mark and myself and my father and his father were very, very friendly. And anyway, obviously we saw that decisions are made in football clubs. And, of course, obviously Alan Jeans was coach at the time. And I guess for all the things that he thought Gary could do really, really well, which obviously is football, there were probably other things that maybe weren't in line with potentially, I guess, the values of the Hawthorn Footy Club, and Gazza found himself out. And
did you guys, you're not consulted by the coaches, but could you agree with that decision at that stage? Because you look at what could have been at Hawthorn.
Yeah, and again, it's funny, players probably overlook a lot of things because it's actually what happens for a game of footy, which is that 2 hours every weekend, and of course, it's amazing who you want to help you win a game. But again, as I said before, a coach probably looks at the all-encompassing sort of stuff and has a really global approach to footy. And I guess Gazza missed out on all those premierships that we were lucky enough to have, but he went on and became a superstar, obviously, as we know. So 1995, he still kicked probably over 120 goals, and we used to obviously have to try and work out exactly what his training methods were, and he was very good at knowing what he thought he could do and how much he had to do on the training track. And a couple of quick stories was that we used to do a time trial. And, of course, anyway, the late Phil Walsh, who was my strength and conditioning coach, and just a wonderful coach and just great support for me. We sort of kicked it off at Geelong together in 1995. And anyway, all we wanted Gazza to do was actually just get a time. And, of course, I said to Gazza, look, mate, I just want you to get a time. You really probably sometimes forget what effect you have on the playing group from a positive point of view if you're actually even seen to be doing what you need to do. And we know your age, and we know there are things that you cut corners on and all that sort of stuff. But if we can just get a time trial time, I'll be satisfied, Phil will be satisfied, and I think the playing group would think, geez, Gazza, because Gazza would always miss the start of pre-season training. He'd be gallivanting around the world with Ozchild and all these other different places, and we'd set up countless plane trips to get him back on time and all this sort of stuff. Anyway, so we get out on the training track. So, of course, he starts, doing his 5K, I think it was 5K time trial, something like that. Anyway, he gets down to the hickey stand end, and anyway, he starts stretching his calves and his hamstrings, and the clock's just running. Then he does another lap, and then there's a supporter hanging over the fence, and of course, anyway, he starts talking to him and does a little bit more stretching, and anyway, he eventually finishes his distance run, and of course, I sort of called him over, and I said, hey, Gazza, I said, oh, how do you reckon you went? And when I asked for a time trial, He goes, yeah, that's all you wanted was just a time trial. It didn't matter how fast or how slow it was. And I said, yeah, you got me there, mate. So, of course, we eventually got a time trial out of him. And there was another time we were playing at Cardinia Park, and it was quite a big game. And, of course, anyway, our team manager at the time used to take the names of the players and tick them off like a roster system, so you'd know who was there and who wasn't there, if anyone was running late. And, of course, we'd always have them, from a numbers point of view, available for our pre-game meeting. So, anyway, that was all fine. So, Gazza's been ticked off, and, anyway, we did everything. And then it came to our group warm-up before the game. And, anyway, Phil has come in, and he had this worried look on his face. And I said, oh, what's up, mate? And he's gone, I can't find Gazza. And then, when you actually think back and think, well, yeah, he was here because I saw him. And I said, just go and ask the team manager if he's definitely here, because then you start to doubt yourself a little bit. Yeah, sure enough, he's here. And I said, look, he used to hide in behind where the plunge pool was, and there was like the trainer's room and then the doctor's room, and he'd sometimes hide in there. Or anyway, Phil's gone in there, not there. Then, of course, said, oh, maybe he's in the toilet. No, not there. He's not in the locker room. And Phil is just like, we've got to go and, we're going to be out in the ground very, very shortly. So, of course, I said, look, don't worry, I'll go and try and find him. So I went to the property room. Sometimes he was in there. Anyway, no. Then all of a sudden I thought, I wonder if anyone's checked the boot stutter's room. So I opened the door, and here's Gazza stripped in his gear. He's got a full pie and another one that he's already half eaten. I said, Gazza, come on, mate, we need to obviously, get you warmed up and ready to go. So out on the ground he goes, and of course I think he ended up kicking 6 goals that day. So I wouldn't certainly suggest that to any of the modern day players, but that was how Gazza saw everything. The time of footy that he played, we know was legendary and outstanding, but just his preparation and where he saw himself before a game.
And he was the captain for about a year and a half. Mark Bairstow got injured, and and then and then Gary Hocking got injured as well. Or no, decided he didn't want to be the captain.
Yeah, that was certainly 1995. We'd looked at obviously what had happened prior, and Mark Bairstow didn't go around in 1995. And anyway, for me, canvassing the playing group and looking around and thinking, well, who's a natural leader amongst the group here? And as far as captaincy goes, and of course for me, it seemed to be Gary Hocking was a standout. And we know best and fairest, match day, aggression, how he trained. And obviously we've gone in 1995 with Gary at the helm, and of course then he was supported by Gazza, Barry Stoneham, who was coming back from a really badly broken ankle, and Kenny Hinkley was the other one. So of course we come to round 6 and we'd just beaten Footscray out at the Whitten Oval, and I got a phone call that Saturday night when I've just walked in the door, and it was Buddha Hocking, and Buddha's gone, Ayresy, this captaincy's not for me. I go, mate, we've won 5 and lost 1. I think everything's going along okay. No, it's just not for me. I don't think I'm ready. Maybe down the track. I said, look, let's have a coffee tomorrow. I'll come down and we'll have a chat. He said, no, I don't think I'm going to change my mind. I said, look, have a think about it. Monday we'll convene, have a chat and just see where you're at with it. But no, Buddha, once he made up his mind, he had made up his mind. So, of course, it wasn't to be that Gary was going to then take the captaincy role for the rest of the season. And, so then we made Barry, Gary and obviously Kenny Hinkley co-captains for the rest of that year, and then they just alternated depending on who was available, and both Kenny was having, I think, groin problems maybe, and then Barry was still coming back from that broken ankle, and he virtually missed most of that year, including the 95 grand final. So, Gazza on match day, couldn't fault what he did.
How close did you come to dropping him from that 1996 elimination final? Tell us the story behind that, and do you regret in a way that you didn't, in a sense, drop him?
Yeah, I do. It was a case of where the guys had been, I guess, looking at how could we actually just make sure the ship was going to stay as right as it could through the latter part of 96, because we'd hit a little bit of turbulence and we were losing games, and anyway, there was a suggestion from the playing group about a curfew. Okay, you want that, you enforce it.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Be
very,
careful
very,
what you wish for.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult at times. You know, a coach really wants his players to become their own disciplinarians in a lot of ways, I guess, and probably the best form of discipline is really self-discipline, because, you know, if the coach has to play the bad cop all the time, it wears him down, and, of course, obviously the players get sick of it, so to speak. So, anyway, Gazza had been probably not abiding by to the curfew, but there were other guys too, but there were differing times, if you like, and one thing that you do find out too is that with high-profile players, there's a lot of people that want to tell you.
Especially in Geelong.
Correct. Yeah. And there were phone calls coming to me, and obviously we were trying to work through it all. Anyway, that's all fine. So we got to the last game, and of course I based, and again, this is a young coach who shouldn't shoot his mouth off. And what I worked out pretty quickly is you just got to leave yourself an out rather than being hard or fast. So anyway, of course, we had to have a recovery day the next day after the last game. And anyway, I said, anyone late won't play. Well, of course, who's late? Gazza. So,
the bloke who was always going to be late.
Exactly, that's right. So, of course, that was a real bad rookie mistake on my behalf. 15, 20 minutes, something like that.
Probably early for Gazza, really.
Well, of course, then on the other side of it, there's guys that obviously who knew what was going down, and, of course, probably what we've got better at is other players covering for other players. And I think that might have even happened, actually, too, that maybe one of the other players went round there and said, you better get down there, you know, because as he said what he said. So anyway, I went to the leadership group and basically said, this is going to be an issue in that, obviously, it's Gary. And, of course, what we had said. And they were very, very good in that he's done the wrong thing, but it is a final. We want to win the final. We're better off, you know, with Gazza obviously being in it and all that. And, of course, I also went to the board as well. And it was a real conundrum, I guess, that you found yourself in having to make a decision because of who he was.
Yeah. And you're a second-year coach.
Absolutely, yep. And as I said, there's things you say as a rookie, and there's probably things you say when you're a little bit more experienced about things. But so speaking to all the people that needed to be spoken to in the end, we played him. And unfortunately, Gazza didn't play well. The team didn't play well. And we got smashed by North Melbourne. And I guess that was probably the start of, okay, are we going to make a shift to where the culture of the next few years is going to lie, and it probably started the ball rolling for a lot of the young kids that were then going to come through and who went on and became premiership players for Geelong. And I'm talking about guys like Stephen King, I'm talking about Darren Milburn, Matty Scarlett, etc., 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 even though one or two of those might have been a little bit later on. But of course then we had obviously a similar sort of situation at the start of 1997 when we had basically said that the guys who had been there for so long, they would be really looked at as in where their, I guess, brownie points were and how many of those were still available, if you like. And we had different programs pre-season for a lot of the older guys too, because we knew that it was just getting, harder and harder for those guys. And if you looked at their form graphs, it was going to be that they were more likely to be going on the other side rather than going up. So we made a decision over that pre-season to play a lot of the kids in the pre-season competition and won through to the grand final. And we obviously got beaten by Carlton, but there was so much growth that was shown that year. And, and then Gazza unfortunately stuffed up again round one, or on the eve of round one. And talking to the leadership group, we actually decided not to play him in that first game against Richmond. And Liam Pickering said, but you do know he averages 6 goals a game against Richmond.
He loved Richmond, didn't
I knew that.
he? Ruffy's still scarred by all those things.
And of course, it didn't really cross my mind until with about a minute to go, Johnny Barnes was running into an open goal and decided to do which Jason Dunstall wouldn't have liked, a dribble kick. And of course, it jagged right instead of left, and we lost the game by 4 points. So there was a few people telling me after the game too in the old coach's box at the MCG that we would have won if we had Gazza playing. And unfortunately that day in the twos, he also did his ACL. So then that was
And he did come back. He tried to come back with no ACL, but it was a pretty slow ending.
Yeah, it was, unfortunately, for him, because he was such a powerful individual, as we know, and he probably didn't even really know he'd done an ACL until I think the next morning, or maybe Monday morning, it might have been confirmed, because as you know, he was so stocky and he was so well built. So, and again, that was, pretty tough at the time, of course, because no one wants to be going out of footy and then, it was always going to be a tough ask. It was going to be possibly however long that he could get back to playing. And in the end, we finished equal top, second on percentage to obviously St Kilda, and then ran into a rampaging Kangaroos on a Sunday night, would you believe, and lost Paul Lynch and on the eve of the finals that year, who was a really good player for us that year. And I think Adam Houlihan might have injured himself in the game. So basically we're sort of struggling a bit forward-wise. And then, of course, the anomaly of the draw, we had to go over and play the Crows over there and lost by a goal or 7 points. Or something.
Is that the one that got away? And it, obviously taking you back to the Lee Colbert mark that potentially changed everything. And do you think you could have won the flag that year?
Yeah, I do. I really do. I thought we had a better side in 97 than we did in 95. And we ran into a rampaging Carlton who'd only lost 2 games that season. And probably a lot of people had said, because Malcolm's left, there's not much in the tank. But we're able to, guys like Ben Graham and Paul Brown and Brad Scholl and guys that sort of helped us through that, Lee Colbert, etc. I thought we had a pretty good young group of talent. And I thought we were a better place to win in 97. And, one player in Wayne Carey who would have done that countless times over the journey, and just the way the kids were coming through, I was certainly pretty confident that, we could have getting over Adelaide. I thought it was either Adelaide or us. No disrespect to St Kilda, but I thought, either of us would have won the flag.
Grant Vernon, the umpire, blindsided by the decision. Take us through your version of what happened in the coach's box.
Clearly a mark. One thing about Lee Colbert is that he's an outstanding young man, but he would go down, in my mind anyway, as one of the most courageous players. We talk about Glenn Archer, guys that have had really no fear, but Lee Colbert would be right up there as being tough, courageous, for me, and obviously making him captain that year and then him doing his knee, for me, that was the cultural shift that was going to be evident at Geelong. And Lee was only, 21, 22 at the time, but not playing, it was really sad because both him and Mark Woolnough did their knees in a pre-season game up at Southport from memory against the Brisbane Lions. And then, of course, we then know that 99, 2000, 2001, 2 and 3 was probably the start of the dynasty of the Brisbane Lions. But, yeah, they were both pretty teary after the game, knowing that their season, on the verge of a season, had actually now been curtailed because of knee injuries. And, yeah, it was clearly, you see it in the coach's box. And I guess if we go back to the rules and regs now, if another umpire had seen it, he potentially would have overruled it. Lee was only, probably 30 metres out. We had really good momentum at the time.
And for a lot of people, I would say, was at the last minute. It was the third quarter, but you were something like 8 or 9 points up. You're 8 points up. It might have changed the course of the game.
Yep. And then we sort of had another couple of other things that maybe a little bit of luck, but I guess you make your own luck because of how the game's played. And then I think might have been Matty Robin's done this 60-metre bomb, and all of a sudden things just fell into, I guess, the Crows' lap.
What happened with his departure? Of course, he didn't play the 99 season. You left that year as well, but did he feel like he wasn't supported by the senior players because he left even though he was the captain of the footy club? Yeah,
look, again, that's probably something that Lee never said to me, and you'd have to ask Lee about it to get the truthful answer. For me, he was supportive. He was there every week. He was there at training, and I couldn't have asked him to do any more. And he had never said to me that he was going to move on. And it really only was when I told him that, hey, mate, I'm got this offer from the Crows, and I'll be moving on after primarily the last game. I think it might have been Freo at Cardinia Park, I think was my last game in 99, and I think we won that too. So, and it was then sort of after that Lee thought this is where he feels his future lies, and he's only like 21, 22. So, but he never told me that he didn't feel that he had the support of the other guys.
And you didn't sense that?
No, because, again, it gets back to what we said before about what happens on match day. And maybe, as we all would know, when decisions are made, some guys don't necessarily agree with the decision, but you've got to respect the decision and, of course, then move on to a point where it shouldn't be a distraction, because if it is, then really you're playing to your egos and not obviously doing what we want to do, and that's win.
Myths and realities about Gary Ablett. So were the times there where the luminaries had come down, he'd have to introduce his teammates as the captain, and he didn't know what their names were?
He probably wouldn't take too much interest in in what the guys were, but or who they were, but
what their names were.
Yeah, or what their names were. But one of the things that opened my eyes too, we had a practice game up at might have been Cobram Baruga up there somewhere, and anyway, of course, the players get a profiling sheet that they've got to fill out, and of course, obviously, the obligatory question is that who's the best player they've ever seen, and of course, I was sitting up the front with the then. I was coach of the reserves, so I was sitting up with the then team manager of the reserves, and still is now, Vic Fuller, a wonderful man. And anyway, he's just saying, have a look at these profile sheets, and 95% would have said that the best player they've ever seen is Gazza. Now, these are his teammates who obviously run out with him every single week. So that impact, if you like. And as we know, we're talking about him again today. And, of course, everyone loves a good Gazza Ablett story, senior that is, obviously, and probably even more so these days with junior. But, yeah, it opened my eyes to the effect that he does have on a playing group. And even when we used to do training drills, and, of course, my philosophy about coaching is that we can't rely on one guy, because we're never going to get the job done if we do that. And home and away games, you may get away with it. Small finals, you may get away with it. But, of course, then when it comes to the big dance, if we haven't got everyone doing that together, it's bloody hard to win. And, yeah, he was quite amazing in just the impact. And he could turn it on at different times, as we all know.
Ablett, Jarman, Carey. I mean, you've coached and played with so many of these stars. Burton. Who was the bloke for you if you had to pick one bloke to, play for you in a final you'd select?
Yeah, Dermy in a heartbeat. For me, Dermy was one of the greatest big-time players. Now, we know he used to dish it out, but he would never whinge if they came gunning for him. And you think back to him when he got poleaxed in the 89, grand final, and his ability. Dippers also too because of what happened that day. But I played alongside him, actually. I think it might have been 1990 when he had broken ribs and he got the old inflated wetsuit. And anyway, we're playing Richmond, and of course, Yabby said, and I think I had a cork thigh or something like that. Anyway, Dunster wasn't playing, so Dermy goes to full forward, and of course I was just sitting in the pocket just watching him do his stuff. And he's ended up jagging 11 before he went off in the last quarter. And here's a guy with broken ribs. So the mental toughness and the capacity to play, and even more so later on when he had that chronic hip problem. And we were at training one night, and of course anyway we were running through down Glenferrie Oval, and of course him and I are running together, and anyway about 20 metres I'd actually got this feeling that Derm wasn't running alongside me, and his hip had just seized up and just basically fell over at Glenferrie Oval. And so the things that he did to get his body to a point to play, there wouldn't be too many people that would have seen that or known that. But yeah, I'd say him every day of the week.
He told me the other day that he'd go in on a Sunday morning and get an epidural for his back.
Yep.
He'd sit there for 8 hours and then he'd get a taxi home and he'd play the next week.
Yeah, and obviously pre-season wise there'd be countless, as we know now, with operations and just what as a group you'd put yourself through back then, and some more so than others to obviously play. But that's what we did, because it came to when we wanted to play, we were obviously very, very, very clear that we were a good side. And the fact of the matter is that playing and winning and then making grand finals and then hopefully winning grand finals was what our charter was. And there were so many guys, and I loved every player that I played with. And I guess when I watched Dermy play, there were just the inspiration and the inspiring contests or situations that he was in. If it didn't make you feel like you had an obligation then to contribute in a manner that was hopefully going to help the side, well, I'm not too sure what would. So for him, for sure.
What, your body's still a temple? How's your body? How's your head? Did you get a lot of head knocks? How are you post-footy?
I must have been one of the luckier ones, I think. So I'm actually pretty good. Look, obviously you get some knees and some back issues, but no, by and large, I think I'm actually not too bad.
And do you speak to John Platten? He's obviously got so many issues now from and we all remember what happened in the 89 grand final.
Yeah, yes, I do. Obviously, one of the great things about Hawthorn is that they're very, very, very happy to celebrate the past, and obviously we are too.
5 flags in 9 years. I don't know if you have a
bit to celebrate there.
Period where you don't have a celebrate.
My club's had 2 in 50, 60 years.
No, look, obviously you think back, and we talk about a lot of stuff today, and it is very reflective about what we're doing, but it's also too great to share that with amazing people, both on the field and off the field. So, yeah, talk to Johnny a bit, and obviously I think this is the greatest sign of respect. We muck up to Johnny and say, do you remember how many premierships I've won, or how many North's medals or whatever? And he plays along with it too. But obviously there is a fear, I guess, that we don't want to see, as we've already seen, and it's becoming more and more so, that any of the people that we've been playing with or seen, that and the head is a pretty important tool. So, yeah, but again, unfortunately, what we now know goes in line with what obviously life is, and we're more educated, we're more aware. There would be countless games where we would say any of the guys that played back in the 70s, 80s and probably even early 90s, we wouldn't necessarily tell the doc everything either. And all we wanted to do was play. And we had such a wonderful coach in Alan Jeans. He would back us in, even if we might have been 70 or 80% fit. And he would certainly give us the green light, if you like. But obviously now we've got to be a lot more careful about where things are at.
Is it a bit sad the way it ended with Hawthorn, not necessarily a bit with yourself as well, but after that 91 flag where Dermot had to depart, you left when you had a year on a contract.
Yep.
Dipper left disappointed.
Tucky
left
Dean
disappointed.
Anderson, St Kilda. Yep.
Well,
Russell Morris before that.
Yeah, tell us about how hard that was. This has been such a successful club in your period, and then it seemed like it all half fell apart to a point where, not too many years later, they almost merged with Melbourne.
Yeah, and that was certainly one of the more disappointing chapters of the footy club, I would have thought, because, again, we were so lucky and we were so well looked after too. And we felt that we were obviously returning that to a degree because we were making finals. I think, starting in my career, 78, played in the reserves grand final, and the seniors went on and won against North Melbourne, and then there were no finals action for 79, 80, 81. But from 82 all through till I finished in 1993, you played grand finals 8 and finals every other year.
It was like death, taxes and Hawthorn in finals, wasn't it?
Yeah, we never got sick of it, obviously.
Probably losing finals.
Correct.
So from that, and then you could sort of sense that there was a changing of the guard, and I guess Chrissy Mew retired as well, and we sort of got Chris back after the 89 back-to-back, and Yabby was always making countless trips down the highway to try and get Mewy to come back. And so then once Tucky left, and he was obviously 38, and then, of course,
He just needed a little bit more time.
Yeah,
Tucky,
well,
he?
that's right. Yeah, no, well, see, it's amazing. Like, he is a freak. There's no doubt about that. And, he's a superstar, and, of course, one of the most competitive animals that I've ever had the pleasure to play with. A wonderful guy, wonderful on the gas, and great leader. Different types of leaders, obviously, as we always know. He'd be different to Lee Matthews, and he had big shoes to fill when he took off. And then I guess Lee was similar after he had to take over from Don Scott. But it was a changing of the guard, most definitely. But then we were sort of positioned okay, because if you think 91, there were guys like Stevie Lawrence, Paul Deere had finally got a crack. Paul Hudson, I think, kicked something like 60-odd goals. Ray Jenke was starting to obviously blossom into a very, very good... Darren Jarman. Obviously, Anthony Condon. Tony Hall seemed to be, getting to a point where he could just string some, games together. Andy Gowers, who'd sort of missed out there a little bit because of injury. Andy Collins, Johnny Platten, Dunstall. So there was still, when you think about it, Chrissy Langford, there was guys that were still there. Johnny Kennedy had finished in 91. Swabby had finished in 91. Dipper, I think, had finished also too. So, yeah, it was the changing of the guard, and then we sort of hang on to 93. But I think 93 was when all those guys left. That was probably too soon in a lot of instances. Maybe some guys could have just been, I guess, given another year. And I'm not talking about me so much, because I probably, was almost finished anyway.
You wanted to play on that? You had a contract?
Yeah, I signed a contract at the start of 1993 for 2 years. So I think loyalty and honouring certain things, but unfortunately it was weighted in the...
Who delivers that news? When you're a legend of the club, you've got a contract?
I think it was Johnny Hook, and might have been Brian Coleman as well. But I'd seen the writing on the wall. Joycey was coach, and he thought I played poorly in the pre-season game back in March or something. And he called me in, and anyway, he said, I didn't like the way you played in that second half. I said, Joycey, it's only a pre-season game, mate. I've been here long enough to sort of know.
These two knobs with medals dangling around the neck, mate. I know when to fire.
Yeah, I think I need to know, or I should know what I'm doing, mate. Anyway, it sort of started, and I just got taken off if a player kicked a goal on me and sitting on the... Anyway, you cop all that because he's making a decision. And then it came to a head late in the season where I got dropped and actually had to play in the twos down at Geelong. And I was fired up, and again, shouldn't have done it, and watched the first quarter, and then said, that's it, I'm out of here, I was frothing at the mouth and all steamed up. And anyway, I actually stopped off at the Carey Roadhouse for a coffee and a burger or something on the way home. Anyway, get home, and we'd been beaten pretty badly, and I shouldn't have done it because I was captain of the footy club, and I regret certainly that. And anyway, on the Monday morning, I got a phone call from Joycey, I need to see you, so I went in there, and anyway, he must have stopped off at the Carey Roadhouse because someone told him that I'd come through there a lot earlier than after the game.
So you'd only played the one quarter?
I watched one quarter. I played in the reserves.
And left. Yeah,
and left early. And anyway, of course, I was sitting on match committee in those days, so it was a little bit frosty, the match committee that week. And anyway, I didn't get picked in that week either. The boys went over to play in WA against West Coast Eagles, and I was running around at Vic Park on Tony Shaw. And I said to Shorey, Jesus, we've come a long way, mate. This is where we're at. And anyway, then the next week I got in, but I only played another 4 or 5 games, including the elimination loss to the Crows.
And they didn't honour the contract?
No, they said, we've got no money. And basically you'll have to play on a base payment of, I think it was about like 20 grand or something like that. And we'll give you, whatever your matches are. And I said, well, we did sign one at the start of the year. I don't think things have changed, personally that much. I played 18 or 19 games out of, 21 or 2. And a couple of those were dropped. And they said, no, it's either you take this or... And basically it was putting me in a position to leave anyway and retire. So even to this day, I say I never actually really retired, but I just sort of moved on. And, because Joycey had been given the flick as well. Knightsy had got the position, and it was all a bit frosty. I think the year itself, from a connection point of view, it wasn't as good as it should have been for a variety of reasons. And you do what you do because you got respect for the decision, the person who's giving those decisions, so you got to cop it on the chin. Would you do it a bit differently if you had your time over again? Yeah, probably. How
long were you bitter, or did you realise at some stage pretty quickly, I've still got 5 premierships and 2 Norm Smith medals?
Yeah, and also too when I got the phone call from Geelong to say, hey, you might have an opportunity to be an assistant coach, because I was already going down that path of being a playing coach at Frankston.
And you knew that Cryo burgers were
good
pretty
joint.
Yeah,
good.
that's exactly right.
So did Joycey.
Yeah, I did. And of course, I remember ringing Jeansy, and I said, hey, yeah, there's either being a playing coach at the VFA as it was then down at Frankston, or possibly not playing, because obviously there's an assistant's role at Geelong. And of course, again, hey, laddie, I think you should take the assistant coach's role and have a look and just sit back and see if you want to go coaching. I'm not sure whether playing coaching is all that good of an idea.
How close did you almost come back to Hawthorn? End of 2004, you looking, potentially for a senior job.
Yep.
Hawthorn are looking at a senior job. You had a number of meetings, I think, with Jason Dunstall?
Only had the one.
The one.
Yeah, and did a presentation, and anyway, probably didn't present all that well, to be honest. I was still probably getting over the Adelaide situation, the relocation, even though you think, you got some understanding that you're going to be out the door. And it was probably... And again, they made the best decision, as we all know. So the vision of Jason Dunstall to see that it was someone new and fresh and young, and rather than sort of any of the older type people, was an absolutely 100% best decision the club had made for a long, long time.
You remember what he said to you?
Yeah, just said you didn't measure up pretty much.
Didn't he say we need to look outside and maybe we might find the next Lee Matthews? And at that stage you knew that was the case, but they did find the next Lee Matthews.
Oh, look, he might have. I can't remember those words exactly. But again, wonderful decision. And the club was obviously, as we said before, in 1996, it would have been absolutely... So many people would have been distraught about the fact if it had that we wouldn't be there, considering how successful we were through the 70s, 80s and 90s.
And then you became a turncoat. You went to Essendon.
Yeah, I did.
A bloke who hated Essendon all the way growing through, and went and to be Kevin Sheedy's lieutenant there for a couple of seasons.
And that happened actually just out of the blue, to be honest. I'd had a year at Fox Footy in the media in 2005. I'd done a little bit at the end of 2004, working with guys like Jace Bennett, and he sort of mentored me a bit, and Kevin Bartlett and all those guys, Matty Campbell and Clinton Gribus and Jim Wilson, etc. So it was sort of another look on the other side for me. And anyway, out of the blue, I got a phone call from Essendon and said Sheeds is looking for somebody and would you be interested? And I said, of course I would be. What could not be positive about working with the great Kevin Sheedy? And when you're a coach, you're always coming up against these guys, and your confidence does take a bit of a dint when you're being told you can't coach and you're this and you're that. and then actually to then sit next to him and watch him. And some of the things I did, he would be sort of similar. Other things, if I had have been probably able to slightly tweak it, maybe it would have been a different sort of story. And again, it was one of the best appointments that I could say for me personally, and had 2 years there and just absolutely loved it. And then of course Kevin, as we all know, rides off into the sunset, and Matty Knights get the job. And of course he said there's no coaching role, but I had been doing opposition analysis as well, and he said, you can do that. Travis Old, I think, was there at the time, and he'd sort of said, this is the role, and if you want it, because I had a little share in a bottle shop down in Middle Park at the time, and anyway, I said, I still want to go coaching, to be honest. I was only 46.
Yeah, you're a young man. You've still got that ambition to coach
absolutely,
at senior level.
Absolutely, especially after having 2 years back at AFL, it certainly just reignited, my sort of want to get back in. And there was a couple of other opportunities along the way, but just didn't work out for whatever reason. And 13 years later, and some of the amazing boys I've been involved with at Port Melbourne and the successes we've had there, it has worked out pretty well.
Are you coaching as well as you ever have?
It's hard for me to probably say that. Some people tell you that, but they probably just want to make you feel good and maybe keep their jobs, who knows. But look, I think I've changed a lot over the last sort of 13 years anyway. There's a difference in how you coach at a full-time club than you do at a part-time club. And we are very much a part-time club that doesn't have a lot of potential resources, and the guys are working full-time, back like what we did back in the sort of 70s and 80s and early 90s. So I think it's a different coaching method that I'm using now, and I've got a couple of good young coaches who are really more hands-on during the week, and of course I'm mentoring those guys, and then match day is hopefully where I sort of sit in the seat and pull the right strings, and hopefully we have a lot more success there.
Do you love going up against the big boys in sense of going against
absolutely
and proving yourself? You're a competitive beast. Take it on the Collingwoods and whoever else.
Most definitely. Because one of the things that was fairly clear when I got the job with the boys at Port Melbourne was that a VFL standalone team wouldn't be able to win a premiership because of the anomaly with all the big boys, if you like.
What's the budget discrepancy? Like, what's your budget?
It's about 800 odd grand, give or take, from what I can sort of sense. Yep. And obviously we're always looking for sponsorship. We're always looking for a multitude of things to give us, hopefully, and bridge that gap between the big boys and the not. Like, we've just signed a 3-year deal with CFMEU, ETU, and ETU Stadium's now obviously the ground, and they've been amazing. And so for us, when you consider we won the flag in 2017 and we'd lost over 300 grand the year before, and to do what the boys had done, they played a game for nothing, you can't help but actually sit back and say, hey, this is what we're doing, and be in awe of what those guys do. And we'd been told that a team couldn't win a premiership. Well, we knocked that on the head in 2011 when we won 21 straight, undefeated. Hadn't been done for just under 100 years, I think in the early 1900s, and we beat an AFL affiliate in Williamstown / the Dogs at the time. So, but we do. Last year we came up against Richmond in the prelim, and they were by far the best side all year. And they had 20 AFL listed players, and with 20 minutes to go in the last quarter, we're 10 points in front. So, that is the adrenaline rush or the competitive juices, because you think, well, they've got everything primarily. And here we are, we're booted off the ground pre-season. We can only train twice a week because of the cricket club and all that sort of stuff. So, but the boys don't whinge, they just roll their sleeves up. And I think it galvanises us to a point where we feel that we are quite a unique organisation.
You would have lived through the gangland wars down at Port Melbourne with a few interesting types there, but you never sort of run into anyone who made Conan a little bit scared of living his life.
No, thankfully not. They've been very supportive, the Port Melbourne people, and it's quite a cosmopolitan and chic area down there now. So, no, they haven't had to escort me off the ground like they did with Tommy Layoff in handcuffs or guns being pulled in some of the big rivalry games against Willie. But there have been some amazing icons of our game in both VFA, VFL. Bobby Skilton obviously was a Port Melbourne player, and of course at a lot of the reunions that the past players have. Gary Bryce is president of the Past Players Association, 3 premierships. But we actually, Crackers Keenan is my ruck coach and I guess mentor now that Yab's no longer around. And anyway, he brings Ronnie Barassi down to different training sessions as well. So we get to see Ron a bit. And I think it's great that the boys of today can actually see that Ron Barassi, who was Port Melbourne, and that he still comes down occasionally and watches the boys train. So,
wow, that's pretty impressive, isn't it?
Very impressive. And I think it's a little bit like, though, when I do recruiting and I talk about Crackers Keenan, they sort of look at you and go, well, who's that? And then we had Bernie Quinlan, who is probably the times gone by, he's a bit like a Patrick Dangerfield, I guess, and you try and, pardon me, you try and compare the two of them, and they look at you and go, who the goddamn hell's Bernie Quinlan, So, but that's just the environment that we're in now. But no, that's a wonderful organisation, and hopefully we can stay relevant for a long, long time.
You're 60 later this year. How long do you want to keep coaching? Have you shut off any AFL connection now? Is that something that you're more interested in concentrating on the borough?
Oh, I think you probably always have it in the background somewhere, but every year it just gets more and more distant. But I'm happy coaching while I believe I've still got the passion and hopefully having a vision, which is to make Port Melbourne the best that it can be as far as a VFL standalone team. I'd like to think there's a little bit of a journey to fulfil, but I'll have to speak to the president and see if he'll extend it more than a year.
Gary Ayres, thanks for your time.
Thanks very much, boys.
Gary.